The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania countryside like a shroud on July 1, 1863, as General John Buford's cavalry scouts peered through their field glasses at the approaching Confederate columns. What began as a chance encounter between foraging soldiers would ignite 3 days of carnage that would forever alter the soul of America. Buford understood the stakes immediately. The rolling hills and ridges around the small college town of Gettysburg offered perfect defensive terrain. If Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia seized these heights first, they could potentially march on Washington itself. The Union's very survival hung in the balance as Buford ordered his dismounted troopers to hold their ground against overwhelming odds. The first shots cracked across the summer air at 7:30, shattering the peaceful morning silence. Confederate General Henry Heth's division, initially seeking shoes for his barefoot soldiers, instead found themselves locked in fierce combat with Buford's determined cavalrymen. The sound of rifle fire echoed off the surrounding hills, drawing more units from both armies like iron filings to a magnet. By mid-morning, the engagement had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Union General John Reynolds, commanding the 1st Corps, rushed his infantry forward to support Buford's hard-pressed cavalry. Reynolds, a Pennsylvanian defending his native soil, positioned his men along McPherson Ridge with grim determination. The general moved among his troops, shouting encouragement above the din of battle, when a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet found its mark. Reynolds tumbled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The first of many high-ranking officers, who would fall during these terrible 3 days. The death of Reynolds sent shockwaves through Union ranks, but it also steeled their resolve. This was no longer just another skirmish. This was a fight for the nation's future. As word spread of the general's sacrifice, soldiers who had never set foot in Pennsylvania before suddenly felt they were defending their own homes. The abstract concept of Union began crystallizing into something more tangible and personal. Meanwhile, Confederate forces poured into Gettysburg from multiple directions. General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps approached from the north, while General Ambrose, Powell Hill's 3rd Corps pressed from the west. The converging Confederate divisions created a deadly pincer movement that threatened to crush the outnumbered Union defenders. According to accounts from the Gettysburg National Military Park archives, the fighting intensified throughout the afternoon as both armies fed more units into the growing maelstrom. Union General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps, still bearing the shame of their rout at Chancellorsville, fought with desperate courage to redeem their reputation. German-American regiments within Howard's command faced particular scrutiny, their loyalty questioned by nativists, despite their willingness to die for their adopted homeland. The streets of Gettysburg became a chaotic battlefield as Confederate forces drove the Union defenders back through the town. Civilians huddled in their cellars while bullets shattered windows and cannonballs crashed through rooftops. Young women like Jenny Wade continued baking bread for Union soldiers, even as the battle raged around them, embodying the civilian spirit. That would become part of Gettysburg's enduring legacy. As evening approached, the battered Union forces retreated to Cemetery Hill south of town, their position appearing precarious to outside observers. General Winfield Scott Hancock, sent by General George Meade to assess the situation, surveyed the battlefield with a tactical eye that recognized both the danger and the opportunity. The Union Army held interior lines on elevated terrain, while Lee's forces were spread in a wide arc around them. That night, as both armies licked their wounds and prepared for the coming storm, neither side could have imagined how this small Pennsylvania town would become the spiritual center of American memory. The stage was set for a battle that would transcend military victory or defeat, becoming instead a crucible where the very meaning of American nationhood would be forged anew. The first day had ended in tactical defeat for the Union, but something deeper was stirring. A sense that this ground was becoming sacred, that the blood being spilled here was sanctifying the earth for future generations of Americans who would come to understand what it truly meant to be one nation, indivisible. Dawn broke crimson over the battlefield on July 2, 1863, as if the very sky wept blood for what was to come. General Robert E. Lee, the Gray Fox himself, stood atop Seminary Ridge surveying the Union positions with the calculating eye of a master tactician. The Army of Northern Virginia had never been stronger, never more confident in their cause, yet something in the morning air whispered of destiny hanging in the balance. Lee's battle plan appeared flawless on paper. General James Longstreet's 1st Corps would strike the Union left flank at Little Round Top and Round Top, while General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps would demonstrate against the Union right at Culp's Hill. The classic hammer and anvil approach had served Lee well at 2nd Manassas in Chancellorsville, but Gettysburg would prove different. This ground seemed to resist Confederate arms as if the earth itself had chosen sides. The fighting erupted with volcanic fury in the wheat field, a 20-acre plot of farmland that would change hands 6 times before the day ended. Union General Daniel Sickles, acting against explicit orders, had advanced his 3rd Corps forward from Cemetery Ridge to what he believed was better ground. The controversial move created a dangerous salient that Lee's generals were quick to exploit, but it also inadvertently disrupted Confederate timing and coordination. In the blood-soaked wheat stalks, soldiers from Maine and Alabama, New York, and Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Texas discovered that courage knew no regional boundaries. The 15th Alabama under Colonel William Oates fought with desperate valor against the 20th Maine, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. These men, who spoke the same language and shared the same Protestant heritage, tore at each other with the fury of ancient tribal enemies. As referenced in Gary Gallagher's comprehensive analysis in the Union War, the psychological transformation occurring on both sides during these hours would prove as significant as the tactical maneuvering. Northern soldiers, many fighting on free soil for the first time, began to grasp viscerally what they were defending. The abstract notion of preserving the Union suddenly became concrete as they witnessed Pennsylvania farmhouses burning and civilians fleeing the advancing Confederate tide. The afternoon's most dramatic moment unfolded on Little Round Top, where Chamberlain's 20th Maine found themselves at the extreme left of the entire Union line. With ammunition running low and Alabama troops preparing for another assault, Chamberlain made a decision that would echo through American military tradition. Instead of retreating, he ordered a bayonet charge down the rocky slope, transforming his desperate defense into an aggressive counterattack that broke the Confederate assault. The charge became instantly legendary, but its deeper significance lay in what it represented about American character. Here were citizen soldiers from Maine, many of them professors and students before the war, who chose to advance when retreat would have been understandable. Their example embodied the volunteer spirit that would become central to American military mythology. Ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances through moral courage rather than professional training. Meanwhile, in the Devil's Den and the Rose Farm, photographers like Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan began capturing images that would bring the reality of war into American parlors for the first time. Their photographs, published in newspapers across the North, showed bloated corpses and shattered landscapes that stripped away romantic notions of martial glory. Yet paradoxically, these harsh images also began creating a shared visual vocabulary of sacrifice that would help bind the nation together in mourning and remembrance. General George Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac, moved carefully among his positions as reports filtered in from across the battlefield. Unlike his predecessors, Meade understood that his role was not to be brilliant but to be steady. The Union could afford to lose battles but not armies. His defensive strategy, though criticized by some as overly cautious, recognized that Confederate success depended on audacious offensive action, while Union victory required merely preventing Confederate success. As night fell on the second day, both armies prepared for what all sensed would be the climactic struggle. The Union had held barely, but at enormous cost. The question now was whether American resolve, North or South, could endure another day of such carnage. The answer would determine not just military victory, but the very nature of American identity for generations yet unborn. The third dawn at Gettysburg, July 3, 1863, rose with an ominous stillness that veteran soldiers recognized as the calm before a hurricane. General Robert E. Lee, his gray beard streaked with premature white from the burdens of command, faced the most consequential decision of his storied career. 2 days of fighting had cost him dearly, yet the Army of Northern Virginia remained a formidable weapon. One final decisive blow might still crack the Union line and open the road to Washington. Lee's eyes fixed on Cemetery Ridge, where the Union center appeared weakest. The plan crystallizing in his mind was elegant in its simplicity: a massive artillery bombardment followed by a direct infantry assault against the Union middle. If successful, it would split Meade's army in half and potentially end the war. The gamble was enormous, but Lee had built his reputation on calculated risks that lesser generals would never dare attempt. The morning passed in tense preparation as Confederate Artillery Chief Edward Porter, Alexander positioned over 150 guns along Seminary Ridge. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, bronze cannons gleaming in the summer sun, their crews working with practiced efficiency to prepare for the largest artillery bombardment ever witnessed on the North American continent. Union soldiers across the valley watched with grim fascination as their enemies prepared to unleash hell upon them. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Alexander's signal gun fired, and the earth seemed to convulse as the Confederate batteries erupted, in unison. The bombardment that followed was apocalyptic in its intensity. Union General Henry Hunt, commanding the Federal artillery, initially ordered his guns to return fire before falling silent, to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault he knew must follow. The silence of Union guns created an illusion of devastating effectiveness that would soon prove costly to Confederate hopes. Through the thunder and smoke, General George Pickett's division formed for the attack that would immortalize his name in American memory. 3 brigades of Virginians, approximately 15,000 men in total, aligned themselves for the mile-long advance across open ground towards Cemetery Ridge. These were among the finest soldiers in Lee's army, veterans of Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg who had never known defeat when properly led and adequately supported. As documented in Kathleen Georg Harrison's research for the Gettysburg National Military Park, the psychological weight of the moment was not lost on the participants. Many Confederate soldiers understood they were embarking on a make-or-break effort that would determine their nation's fate. They advanced with the measured tread of men who knew they were writing history with their blood, their battle flags, snapping in the hot July breeze as they moved toward destiny. The charge began magnificently, the long gray lines maintaining perfect alignment as they crossed the Emmitsburg Road and began climbing toward the Union positions. But as they approached the stone wall marking the Union center, concentrated rifle fire and canister shot from Hunt's carefully conserved artillery began tearing gaps in their ranks. The mathematical precision of modern firepower met the romantic courage of the old world, and mathematics proved the stronger force. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, his black hat perched on his sword point to guide his men through the smoke, actually reached the Union line at what would become known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. For a brief shining moment, Confederate battle flags flew over Union guns, and Southern victory seemed within grasp. But the moment passed like a summer thunderstorm, and Armistead fell mortally wounded beside the very cannons he had briefly captured. The retreat of Pickett's survivors marked more than tactical defeat. It represented the beginning of the Confederacy's psychological decline. The Army of Northern Virginia had attempted its ultimate gamble and failed. While the war would continue for nearly 2 more years, July 3, 1863, marked the moment when Confederate independence shifted from probable to merely possible, then from possible to increasingly unlikely. As Lee, personally, rallied his broken forces, taking full responsibility for the disaster, both armies began to comprehend that they had participated in something epical. The charge would be remembered not just as a military operation, but as a defining moment of American courage and tragedy, when brother fought brother with desperate valor on ground that was becoming sacred through shared suffering. The silence that descended over Gettysburg on the morning of July 4, 1863, was more profound than the thunder of artillery that had preceded it. Independence Day dawned gray and somber, as if the very heavens mourned the carnage of the previous 3 days. General Robert E. Lee, his magnificent army bloodied but not broken, faced the bitter reality that his bold gamble for Confederate independence had failed on the same date Americans had first declared their freedom from tyranny. The Army of Northern Virginia began its somber withdrawal under a steady drizzle that turned the roads into muddy quagmires. Lee's soldiers, who had marched into Pennsylvania with songs on their lips and victory in their hearts, now trudged homeward in sullen columns, their wounded comrades groaning in ambulance wagons that stretched for miles. The general himself rode among his men, accepting responsibility for the defeat with a dignity that only enhanced his legend among those who served under him. Behind Confederate lines, the scope of devastation became apparent as the smoke cleared. Over 51,000 Americans had fallen as casualties during the three-day battle, a number that staggered contemporary comprehension. The wheat fields and orchards around Gettysburg had been transformed into a vast charnel house where North and South lay intermingled in death, their sectional differences rendered meaningless by the democracy of the grave. General George Gordon Meade, cautious to the end, chose not to pursue Lee's retreating army with the aggressiveness that President Abraham Lincoln desired. The Army of the Potomac had fought magnificently, but remained badly mauled by the encounter. Meade understood that his primary mission, preventing Confederate victory, had been accomplished, and he was reluctant to risk his army in pursuit, operations that might reverse his hard-won success. The citizens of Gettysburg emerged from their cellars to confront a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Jenny Wade, the young woman who had been killed while baking bread for Union soldiers, became the battle's only civilian casualty and an early symbol of innocent sacrifice. Her death, random and senseless, somehow captured the tragedy of a nation at war with itself more powerfully than the calculated heroism of professional soldiers. As referenced in Drew Gilpin Faust's groundbreaking work, This Republic of Suffering, the immediate aftermath of Gettysburg confronted Americans with unprecedented challenges of identification, burial, and mourning. The task of distinguishing Union from Confederate dead, Pennsylvania from Georgia, proved nearly impossible among the bloated corpses scattered across the battlefield. Death had created a grotesque equality that transcended the political divisions that had caused the war. Local attorney David Wills, appointed by Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin to coordinate the cleanup efforts, quickly realized that Gettysburg required something more than mere burial details. The magnitude of sacrifice demanded appropriate commemoration, something that would honor the dead while providing meaning for the living. His proposal for a national cemetery would ultimately provide the stage for the most important speech in American history. The logistical challenges were staggering. Thousands of horses and mules lay putrefying in the summer heat, requiring immediate disposal to prevent disease. Human remains, many mangled beyond recognition, needed identification and proper interment. The stench of death hung over the town, like a malevolent fog, while swarms of flies and the constant howling of wounded men created an atmosphere of apocalyptic horror. Yet even amid this carnage, something transformative was occurring in the American consciousness. Northern newspapers, their reporters having witnessed the battle firsthand, began crafting narratives that emphasized shared sacrifice rather than sectional triumph. The heroism of Confederate soldiers like Louis Armistead, who died leading Pickett's charge, was acknowledged alongside Union heroes like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. The battle was beginning its transformation from military event to national mythology. Southern newspapers, while acknowledging defeat, praised their soldiers' courage and Lee's leadership while searching for lessons that might prevent future disasters. The Confederacy's ability to continue fighting after such losses demonstrated remarkable resilience, but also revealed the terrible arithmetic of attrition that would ultimately doom their cause. As both armies departed Gettysburg, leaving behind only the dead and the memories, the small Pennsylvania town stood at the threshold of its greatest transformation. From a minor county seat known mainly for its Lutheran seminary and small college, Gettysburg was about to become the spiritual center of American memory, a place where the meaning of nationhood would be redefined for generations yet unborn. 4 months after the guns fell silent, Gettysburg prepared to host a ceremony that would transform the battlefield from a site of carnage into hallowed ground. November 19th, 1863, dawned crisp and clear as thousands of visitors descended upon the small Pennsylvania town for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Among them rode a tall, melancholy figure whose presence would elevate the occasion from local commemoration to national consecration. President Abraham Lincoln had initially been invited almost as an afterthought, expected to offer brief remarks following the main address by renowned orator Edward Everett. The president's secretaries advised against attending, arguing that his presence might appear unseemly at what some critics characterized as a partisan political event. But Lincoln understood instinctively that Gettysburg represented something larger than battlefield tourism or Republican vote gathering. It was becoming the spiritual center of a reborn American nation. The crowds that gathered represented a cross-section of American society, still struggling to comprehend the war's meaning. Veterans who had fought at Gettysburg returned with their wives and children, pointing out landmarks where they had witnessed history unfold. Bereaved families came seeking closure at graves of sons and husbands who had died far from home. Curiosity seekers arrived by train from distant cities, drawn by newspaper accounts that had already begun transforming the battle into national myth. Edward Everett, former Harvard president and diplomat, delivered a masterful 2-hour oration that meticulously recounted the battle's events while drawing parallels to ancient Greek struggles for freedom. His classical references and flowery rhetoric represented the old style of American oratory, formal and elaborate, befitting what many considered the nation's greatest crisis since the Revolution. The crowd listened respectfully, many taking notes as Everett's sonorous voice carried across the cemetery where fresh graves dotted the landscape. Then Lincoln rose to speak, and in less than 3 minutes, redefined American identity for all time. His brief address, initially dismissed by some newspapers as disappointingly short, contained within its 10 sentences a complete reimagining of the American experiment. The president's opening words, 77 years ago, deliberately invoked biblical cadences while anchoring the current struggle in the ideals of the Declaration of Independence rather than the compromises of the Constitution. According to detailed analysis in Gary Will's Lincoln at Gettysburg, the president's address represented nothing less than a constitutional revolution accomplished through rhetoric rather than legislation. By grounding American nationhood in the Declaration's promise of equality rather than the Constitution's acceptance of slavery, Lincoln subtly but decisively shifted the war's meaning from mere Union preservation to human liberation. The dead at Gettysburg had died not just to save the Union, but to complete the work of the Founding Fathers. The audience's initial reaction was mixed, with many seemingly uncertain how to respond to such brevity after Everett's elaborate performance. But Lincoln's words possessed a mysterious power that grew stronger with repetition and reflection. Newspapers across the North gradually recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a speech that managed to be both deeply religious and completely non-sectarian, both specifically American and universally human. The cemetery dedication marked Gettysburg's transformation from battlefield to shrine, but it also represented a crucial shift in American memory-making. Previous national commemorations had typically celebrated victories or mourned defeats along sectional lines. Lincoln's address, however, created space for eventual reconciliation by honoring Confederate courage while maintaining that Union victory served divine purposes. The president's careful balance between magnanimity and moral clarity would become a template for American memory in the decades ahead. Photographers captured images of the crowd, creating some of the earliest documentation of presidential speeches, while newspaper stenographers struggled to record Lincoln's words exactly as delivered. The president himself had written and rewritten the address multiple times, understanding that this particular moment required language worthy of the sacrifice it commemorated. His final text achieved the rare feat of being simultaneously accessible to common citizens and profound enough for philosophers. As the ceremonies concluded and visitors began their journeys home, Gettysburg had completed its metamorphosis from obscure Pennsylvania town to national pilgrimage site. The battlefield would never again be merely a location where armies had fought. It had become a place where Americans would come to understand what their nation meant and what it demanded of its citizens. 50 years after the smoke cleared over Cemetery Ridge, Gettysburg witnessed a remarkable transformation that would have seemed impossible to the bitter combatants of 1863. July 1st through 3rd, 1913, brought together the largest gathering of Civil War veterans in American history for the Great Reunion, an event that symbolized the nation's long journey from fratricidal warfare to reconciled memory. Nearly 55,000 veterans, both Union and Confederate, converged on the battlefield where they had once tried to kill each other. White-bearded men in their 70s hobbled across terrain where they had charged as young soldiers, their sons and grandsons helping them navigate the now peaceful fields that had once run red with American blood. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran special trains to accommodate the massive influx of visitors, while the federal government erected a tent city larger than many contemporary American cities. The reunion's most powerful moment occurred when Union and Confederate veterans spontaneously recreated Pickett's charge, but this time the advancing Confederates were met not with rifle fire, but with handshakes and embraces. General Daniel Sickles, now 87 years old and long since reconciled to his controversial tactics, watched from his wheelchair as former enemies clasped hands across the stone wall that had marked the high water mark of the Confederacy. Tears streamed down weathered faces as men who had survived the war's carnage celebrated their shared survival rather than their ancient antagonisms. President Woodrow Wilson addressed the assembled veterans, declaring that, "We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten." Wilson's words, while perhaps too optimistic about the completeness of national reconciliation, captured the genuine spirit of healing that characterized the reunion. The blue and gray had become the blue and gray together, their shared experience of war creating bonds stronger than their remembered divisions. The reunion coincided with a broader cultural movement to commemorate the Civil War as a heroic struggle between honorable opponents rather than a moral crusade against slavery. This reconciliationist narrative, while successful in binding the nation's wounds, also obscured the conflict's root causes and consequences. The memory of Gettysburg was being sanitized, transformed from a battle over human bondage into a romantic tale of American courage and brotherhood. Veterans organizations from both sides had worked for decades to preserve the battlefield, purchasing key terrain features and erecting monuments that told the story from multiple perspectives. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, founded in 1864, had gradually acquired most of the crucial battle sites, while Congress authorized the establishment of Gettysburg National Military Park in 1895. These preservation efforts ensured that future generations would be able to walk where their ancestors had fought and died. As documented in David Blight's Race and Reunion, the reconciliationist memory of Gettysburg came at a significant cost, the systematic erasure of slavery from popular understanding of the war's causes and consequences. African American veterans found themselves largely excluded from the reunion ceremonies, despite their crucial role in Union victory. The voices of former slaves, who had understood the war as a struggle for their freedom, were marginalized in favor of narratives that emphasized white sectional reconciliation. The Great Reunion marked the final major gathering of Civil War veterans, as age and mortality were rapidly thinning their ranks. Within another decade, most would be gone, taking with them first-hand memories of the war's reality. Their departure left Gettysburg in the hands of historians, park rangers, and storytellers who would shape the battle's memory for generations yet unborn. Today, Gettysburg continues to serve as America's premier site of Civil War memory, welcoming millions of visitors annually who seek to understand their nation's defining crisis. The battlefield has evolved from Confederate defeat to Union victory to reconciliation shrine to complex historical site where multiple narratives compete for attention. Lincoln's vision of a new birth of freedom remains partially fulfilled, while his hope that these dead shall not have died in vain continues to challenge each generation of Americans to prove worthy of their sacrifice. The small Pennsylvania town that accidentally hosted the war's turning point has become a permanent reminder that American democracy requires constant renewal, that freedom demands vigilance, and that unity must be continually chosen rather than simply assumed. In this transformation lies Gettysburg's greatest victory, not the defeat of Lee's army, but the creation of sacred space where Americans can wrestle with the meaning of their shared inheritance.